Well, welcome, Andy. Thank you very much for joining us again. Delighted to have you the chance to benefit once again from your encyclopaedic knowledge of the Balkan conflicts. Much of it distilled in your excellent book, Joint Criminal Enterprise: Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Slobodan Milosevic and the Serbs is Wrong. I want to revisit some of the foundational myths of the now massively discredited official narrative, including Srebrenica, Racak, and Kosovo. I'd like to start off by addressing the trial of the man cast as the central villain in this psychodrama, Slobodan Milosevic, much maligned, of course, as the butcher of Bosnia. But in fact, it seems to me a patriot, a popular elected politician, a committed multiculturalist, and essentially a man of peace. His trial, as we know, was the longest in criminal history, over 4 years, and still far from complete by the time of his highly suspicious death in custody. So if we can talk about the first words, basically, that Milosevic said when he came into court, was he said, "It's a false tribunal." What was he basing that on?
Well, he was basing that on the law. The UN Security Council doesn't have the authority to adjudicate law, and so it doesn't have the authority to establish a tribunal to adjudicate law. And when the first defendant came before this tribunal, they tried to challenge the legality of the tribunal, but they could only appeal it to the tribunal's appeals chamber, which, not surprisingly, declared that it was competent to rule on its own legality, and no surprise here, ruled that it was legal.
That doesn't sound a really good custom and practice thing to pursue, does it? But the most fundamental right of all, surely, is to have your case heard in a legally established court.
Right.
And basically, the ICTY wasn't that. So he was denied his fundamental right to a fair and public hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing lawful about the establishment of that tribunal.
Much of his trial seems to me to have been conducted in secret. Closed sessions, the drop of a hat, redacted testimony, anonymous witnesses, overwhelming hearsay evidence, judges constantly cutting off his mic and this sort of thing. It really was grotesque, wasn't it? And of course, they moved the goalposts on what they thought was legal. They changed their procedures, and it was like a Moscow show trial, basically.
Yeah, it totally was.
Why did Milosevic decide to defend himself?
Because nobody understood the material better than he did. He was a central figure. He understood what was going on better than any attorney would have. And secondly, if the tribunal is an unlawful, politically motivated creation, why is he going to appoint an attorney to represent him? I mean, he was a politician, so he's sort of, I mean, it's really all about politics. So he's fighting, on his own turf, so to speak, rather than have a lawyer who's not, is politically sophisticated, trying to do what he can do a better job of himself, and what he did do a better job of.
In fact, he had a law degree, didn't he, from Belgrade University, as I recall. So
Yeah.
he wasn't complete novice.
No, he wasn't.
So, nevertheless, he has a lawyer imposed on him by the court, which I think is pretty much unprecedented. And I think the court said that it was doing it in the interest of his health and the reputation of the tribunal. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, that lawyer, Stephen Kay, had previously argued that he wasn't himself competent to advance Milosevic's defense. So they imposed a lawyer on him who himself said that he wasn't competent to be his lawyer. And the argument about that they're doing it to protect his health is laughable because when he needed medical attention, they wouldn't let him have it.
The whole case against Milosevic rested on two presumptions, didn't it? That a genocide had been committed and that it was driven by the goal of his wanting a greater Serbia.
Right.
How much investigation took place before the indictments were issued?
Probably not very much. Because if they had, they wouldn't have charged him how they did. But it was always about, this was always politically motivated. It's I think the most important thing to keep in mind is they made these indictments in order to justify the foreign policy of NATO against Serbia and against Yugoslavia. So it was really about trying to give a veneer of legitimacy to the propaganda that we had been subjected to in the West, where we were told that Slobodan Milosevic was a Serbian nationalist and that the wars in the former Yugoslavia were all provoked by his attempts to create a greater Serbia, by carrying out ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Bosnian Muslims and the Croats and the Kosovo Albanians and everybody else.
Do you think that Milosevic ever thought he could win the case?
I don't think that. I think that he thought, and he was right, that he could prove his innocence. I don't think he ever believed that justice would be served by that tribunal.
The deck was so stacked against him, wasn't it? I think it's probably worth reminding ourselves that the ICTY was the brainchild of the CIA.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us? There's a memo, isn't there, in existence, which I think is in your book?
Yeah, there is. There's a memo where the CIA comes up with the idea to establish this war crimes tribunal. And the memo has been declassified. And if you look at the footnote in my book, I give the link where you can download the memo off of the CIA website and see for yourself that, that the whole point of the tribunal was to publicize Serbian crimes in order to discredit the Serbs. And they even say in the memo that if they gave equal treatment to war crimes committed by other factions, that the tribunal would be seen as favorable to Belgrade. So the whole idea was to have a biased tribunal.
But it was not only the fact that you heard everything that was bad about Milosevic. It's you heard crimes against the Serbs were always being suppressed, and this was evidence that the court simply refused to hear repeatedly.
Yeah, repeatedly during his trial and also during the trial of Radovan Karadzic. Whenever evidence of crimes against Serbs would come up, the tribunal would actively move to exclude that evidence. And even when people were demonstrably guilty of committing crimes against Serbs, they'd be acquitted by the tribunal. One example would be Nasser Oric in Srebrenica. And he publicly bragged to Western journalists about the atrocities he was committing against the Serbs around Srebrenica. And he bragged to Bill Schiller from the Toronto Star and another journalist whose name escapes me from the Washington.
John Pumphrey, was it? John Pumphrey? Yeah.
That's exactly right, from the Washington Post. And he showed them videotapes of the Serbs that he had massacred, and they both wrote articles about it contemporaneously that were published. he told General Morion, who testified in the Milosevic trial, that him and his men killed Serbs literally every night, and that, Morion also testified that the Serbs had taken him to directly, witness for himself the bodies of the Serbs that Orich and his men had butchered. But when the tribunal put Orich on trial, they didn't call any of those witnesses, and then they acquitted him.
I think he ended up serving all of 2 years, didn't he? And that was the sort of time he'd spent in detention anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, nothing was done to him.
Unbelievable. Let's move on to the witness that they did use against Milosevic, which this mentally unstable individual, this Croatian mercenary, I think he'd fought for all sides, Dražen Ademovic. What can you tell us about him?
Well, I can tell you that his testimony was inconsistent across the different trials. That, his estimates of the number of people who were killed, first he said it was 1,200 people at the Branivo military farm that had been executed, and he based that on how many buses full of prisoners came. And then he later on, recanted that testimony when he was asked, I think in the Karadzic trial, he said that he had no idea how many buses full of prisoners came, and that he didn't count them, and that he had sort of blacked out of his memory the events of that day because it was traumatic, and that he really couldn't say what had happened. And so, but there were other, like there were other Srebrenica trials, like the Popovic trial and the Krstić trial, where his testimony was relied on to secure their convictions.
And yet he himself had been certified by the court as unfit to stand trial for the crimes he had admitted. I mean, he wasn't well enough to stand trial himself, but he was somehow deemed okay to testify against a lot of high-profile, very, very high-profile people.
Yeah, and it also, gets back that everything he testified to, he either recanted or openly admitted in court he had no basis for what he was saying.
I think it was also interesting that the ICTY never bothered to pursue the 7 co-conspirators, as it were, the people he said shot, people at this farm, even though their names and addresses were public knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, Karadzic got one of them to testify as a defense witness. This guy was a Slovene named Frank Koss. And he testified that the number of people executed at this farm was about 700. And when Karadzic put this to Erdemovic was like, oh yeah, maybe that's what it was.
I think Milosevic actually had him on the back foot, didn't he? He challenged him about a statement that he'd made saying that all ethnicities had taken part in the shootings. And Milosevic asked him directly whether he'd seen or heard Serbians at the time. And Ademovic admitted he hadn't.
Right. Yeah, I think Milosevic asked him something to the effect of, did you hear anybody say we were doing this in order to exterminate the Bosnian Muslims? So like any evidence that this was being done out of genocidal intent, because people who took part in the executions at Branivo military farm testified that the reason why this was being done was because the Bosnian Serbs were not able to effectively guard the prisoners and the military forces that were usually stationed in Zvornik were off fighting in Jepa. And so Zvornik was basically undefended, and the column of men from Srebrenica was heading their direction. And they were afraid that the prisoners would be freed and that they would join up with this column of men and that they would essentially destroy Zvornik. So if they eliminated the prisoners, then they've freed up their men to try and defend Zvornik, because they can't defend Zvornik and guard the prisoners at the same time. So they got rid of the prisoners.
And as I think you said when we had an earlier encounter, this was a very fateful decision as far as the Bosnian Serbs were concerned. Just sticking with the actual trial for a second, going back to that, why did it take, I think, 7 to 10 years to finally come up with a single consolidated indictment against him? Why did that happen? Why did it take so long?
Well, first they charged him over Kosovo, and then after he was in their custody, they added on charges for Croatia and for Bosnia. And I think they realized that the allegations for Kosovo were very thin, because, as you may recall, at one point, the U.S. State Department told us that 500,000 Kosovo Albanians were missing and that they had probably been killed at the hands of the Serbs. And there was a genocide unfolding in Kosovo. And they sent in, after the war, all of these war crimes investigators who went looking and came up empty-handed. That, there was no concentration camp in the soccer stadium in Pristina. There was no bodies being thrown into the mines at Trepča. All of this stuff that we were told had happened hadn't happened, and so they had to pad up the indictment.
The prosecutors had to kind of admit there was no smoking gun evidence, I suppose you could put it like that. And is this really the point at which the tribunal invents this, as far as I can see, new offense of joint criminal enterprise, the thing that becomes the new magic bullet?
Joint criminal enterprise is really just sort of a mechanism, to prosecute people for crimes that they may have had nothing to do with and no direct knowledge of.
As a professor said, just convict everyone, JCE. That's what he said it stood for, didn't he? But I mean, a wonderfully elastic concept. You can be guilty even if you took no part in something, in the crime, you had no knowledge of it, you failed to prevent the act, or even if you failed to see it was a foreseeable consequence of events. So, I mean, it was almost impossible to get off, really.
Well, yeah, I mean, because if you have a political objective and somebody else shares your political objective, but they use criminal means to try to achieve that objective, they can say that you were part of the joint criminal enterprise, even though you didn't have anything to do with the crimes that were committed.
Milosevic is always portrayed, isn't he, as an evil mastermind pulling all the strings. What de facto influence did he have on the ground, do you think?
Well, the Bosnian Serbs, their army was made out of the remnants of the Yugoslav People's Army. Because what happened in Bosnia when the JNA withdrew its forces was that the Croats and the Bosnian Muslims had already deserted from the JNA. And so the only people who were in the JNA in Bosnia were the Bosnian Serbs. And when the JNA withdrew, well, the Bosnian Serbs didn't have anywhere to withdraw to. So they stayed where they were and they kept their equipment. And that was how the Bosnian Serbs became the best armed faction in that war. Because the Yugoslav People's Army was like, I think it was like the fourth largest army in Europe. And they just stayed there where they were with their equipment. And the Serbs who were living in Serbia, they went home, but the Bosnian Serbs stayed where they were because they lived in Bosnia.
It's known, isn't it, that Milosevic was very aware of the dangers of a bloodbath in Srebrenica, and he tried to restrain
Yeah.
Karadzic, did he not? What happened?
Well, Milosevic was always trying to push the Bosnian Serbs to accept peace agreements that were, in the minds of the Bosnian Serbs, disadvantageous to them because the Bosnian Serbs were the majority population throughout most of Bosnia. They, the Muslims were mainly concentrated in the urban areas, but the Bosnian Serbs, were spread out over a larger area. And Milosevic, even though the Bosnian Serbs were the majority population in about 70% of Bosnia before the war, Milosevic wanted the Bosnian Serbs to, accept that, 50% or even less of Bosnia should be part of Republika Srpska. And the Bosnian Serbs had already militarily been able to capture more than that and didn't want to give it up in a peace agreement, which they knew would mean the displacement of their own population from those areas. But yeah, he was trying to get them to accept peace agreements. He even at one point blockaded the Drina so that they couldn't get reinforcements from Serbia. I mean, there's a lot of Serbs hold that against him.
You've had a prison correspondence with Karadzic, interestingly, haven't you?
Yeah.
What was your impression of his relationship with Milosevic? I mean, did they get along at all, or was Karadzic very much a loose cannon?
Well, I don't know that I would exactly call Karadzic a loose cannon. Karadzic didn't answer to Slobodan Milosevic. And there was some, there was tension between the two of them. I mean, I didn't get the impression from dealing with Karadzic that he, was angry with Milosevic or that he blamed him for not being more supportive. But I know that there are certainly Serbs who, do hold that against him and think he should have been more supportive of the Bosnian Serbs.
Did you like Karadzic from what you could glean from the correspondence? I mean, it's very difficult, I suppose, to get a full picture. But what impression did you form?
I got the impression that, I got this impression about Milosevic and about Karadzic is that they are both highly intelligent men, very intelligent, both of them. And I also had the opportunity to speak with Karadzic and with Milosevic on the phone. I never got to meet either one of them face to face in person, but I did get to speak to them on the phone. And Slobodan Milosevic is a was a very congenial person, very, kind and soft spoken and just a very warm and likable person. And Karadzic was also, not quite as much that way, but still, very pleasant individual.
So Holbrooke had a very high opinion, didn't he, at one stage of Milosevic? Certainly
Well,
said
yeah.
he was good to negotiate with, and generally delivered on what he said he would do.
Mhm.
The ICTY, going back to them, they claimed, of course, that they'd ended impunity for perpetrators of war crimes. This was a total hypocrisy, wasn't it? Because they refused to prosecute NATO war crimes. Can you tell us a little bit about, just how that came about? I mean, it was never going to happen, was it, that they were going to prosecute NATO for anything?
No, and I mean, Jamie Shea even boasted about it because when NATO bombed Yugoslavia, they bombed radio television Serbia and they killed 16 people there. Well, the ICTY, they indicted Dragomir Milosevic and prosecuted him. And one of the counts in his indictment was that they was that he had shelled TV Sarajevo. So, it's the same thing. And they, didn't prosecute anyone from NATO. They also prosecuted him for uh, Bosnian Serb forces that fired on buses and trams in Sarajevo. Well, NATO famously bombed commuter trains in Serbia. There's video of that. And so NATO committed some of the very same war crimes that the tribunal prosecuted Bosnian Serbs for. And when Jamie Shea was, asked if he was, and he was the spokesperson for NATO when we were bombing Yugoslavia, if he was concerned that the tribunal might indict anyone from NATO, he went on and he explained that NATO is the one who funds the tribunal, so he wasn't concerned about that in the least.
I think that what the impression we get, of course, from this whole operation, this whole kind of rigged court, as it were, is that you're only going to hear one side of the story we want to tell. And basically, I remember Jeffrey Nice going on about how the lead prosecutor in the Milosevic trial, basically saying that he really didn't. It was all about telling the stories of the victims being the Muslims, of course. And he didn't know really when to stop. He wanted to call 1,000 witnesses at one point. It was just like, never mind the quality, feel the width. I mean, I got the sense that he didn't know how to go about getting a conviction. Did you get that feeling?
Well, I did get that impression. I mean, I got the impression that they had made a mistake in the way they charged. I mean, Milosevic was an innocent man, so I mean, he's going to be difficult to credibly prosecute. Um, but the prosecution really put all of its eggs in the Greater Serbia basket because the whole linchpin theory of the case against Milosevic was this theory of joint criminal enterprise. And the object of the joint criminal enterprise was to establish a Greater Serbia through the commission of the specific crimes charged in the indictment. So their theory of Milosevic's guilt was, even though Slobodan Milosevic may not have had anything to do with the commission of a particular crime, those crimes were committed in the pursuit of Greater Serbia, the establishment of a Greater Serbia. And so, because they say Milosevic was the mastermind of this plot to create a Greater Serbia, he was responsible for the commission of those crimes. That was sort of the basis of the case against him. And the problem, though, is that Slobodan Milosevic never believed in this idea of a Greater Serbia. Slobodan Milosevic, when the Serbs in the Krajina region of Croatia declared their independence from Croatia, those Serbs said that they wanted to join Serbia. that they wanted to secede from Croatia and join Serbia. And when Milan Babic was brought by the prosecution to testify against Milosevic, the prosecutor asked him, what was Milosevic's reaction when you guys did that? And Babic explained that there was a very sharp reaction from Milosevic, that he was dead set against it. And when the Serbian assembly met after the Krajina Serbs declared their independence from Croatia and announced their intention to join Serbia, the Serbian assembly would not put their proposal on the agenda to even debate it. And the Serbian government issued official statements that they had no territorial pretensions towards any part of Bosnia or any part of Croatia. And when David Owen and other Western negotiators testified in the Milosevic trial, they testified that Milosevic always accepted the Republican borders of Croatia and Bosnia and didn't have any intentions of bringing any of those territories into Serbia. So it's kind of a problem if you're the prosecutor and the whole basis for your charges is that Milosevic is this mastermind of Greater Serbia, and everything he's ever said and done is evidence that he wasn't trying to do anything of the kind, and that he was even trying to badger the Bosnian Serbs into accepting peace agreements that would have given them less territory that they didn't want to take.
Yeah, they had a real problem.
Yeah.
Now, looking at the refusal of the ICTY to allow the Serb point of view to be heard, and any evidence of any crimes against Serbs had to be suppressed, we get a very obviously one-sided view of what was going on in the Balkans. And you've made the point in your book, and I think it's well worth bringing out, that without the context, we don't have the truth.
Right.
And so, can you talk about? I mean, I think you apply it to the sort of, looking at the wartime actions of the Allies during the war, for example. They wouldn't have looked too good if you didn't know why they did what they did.
Yeah, if all you see is the Allies carpet bombing Dresden, and you don't have any idea what it is that the Nazis have done, then yeah, it doesn't look good, because it looks like all of this is happening in a vacuum. And that's sort of the way it was at the tribunal, because the tribunal is established to publicize crimes committed by the Serbs, and the prosecutor decides who's going to be indicted and what they're going to be charged with, and the defense can only present evidence that's relevant to the indictment. That was always the excuse when Milosevic or Karadzic or Mladic or any of these would want to bring up evidence of crimes that had been committed against Serbs, is that, well, this isn't really relevant to the indictment. See, you're charged with committing this crime, and what other people may have done isn't relevant to what we're trying to achieve in your trial. And
it's
so
what they call tu quoque, isn't it, in legalese?
Yes. But the problem is those crimes against Serbs weren't prosecuted, or if they were prosecuted, like I was saying earlier about Nasser Oric, they were not prosecuted in a way that was likely to secure a conviction, because why wouldn't you have brought the witnesses I listed? Bill Schiller, John Pomfret, General Morion. Why wouldn't you have brought these people who were direct witnesses of your defendant, telling them that he had committed these crimes? Why wouldn't you bring them to testify if you were trying to secure a conviction? because
Absolutely.
by acquitting him, it makes it look like he didn't do anything, that he was innocent. And that
Yeah.
may have been the goal all along. I mean, they did the same thing with the Croats, because in the end they were acquitted for Operation Storm and Operation Flash. I mean, the biggest single incident of ethnic cleansing carried out in the former Yugoslavia. They were acquitted of all of it by this so-called War Crimes Tribunal, even though there's the transcript of the meeting of Tudjman with his generals at Brioni, where they planned the whole thing out. And they even talk about how they staged false flag attacks against their own people in order to blame the Serbs to give themselves an alibi to carry out their ethnic cleansing operation. Tudjman openly speaks with his generals about how they're going to give disingenuous assurances of human rights protection to the Serbs. And he flat out says that they're only pretending. Talks about how he goes to Geneva to negotiate in bad faith, not to try to find a solution to a negotiated solution to the problem, but to conceal their plans for ethnic cleansing. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's all right there, and they got acquitted.
It's their own minutes, and they're talking about making the Serbs disappear.
Yeah, yeah, they say that in their own meetings. They authenticated this themselves.
Yeah, it's truly, absolutely amazing. Now, of course, at the end of the day, you found, didn't you, an effective exoneration of Milosevic in case in 2017. Can you tell us about this? This is a co-conspiracy, wasn't it?
Right. So the joint criminal enterprise that I alluded to earlier, about Slobodan Milosevic being a mastermind of this conspiracy to create a greater Serbia. Well, in his indictment, Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic were listed as co-conspirators, as people who were also involved in the joint criminal enterprise. And in the Karadzic and Mladic indictments, Slobodan Milosevic was listed as one of the co-conspirators who was in the conspiracy with them to, establish Serb control over these regions in Bosnia through the commission of crimes charged in the indictment. Well, the Karadzic trial chamber and the Mladic trial chamber both found that there was no evidence that Slobodan Milosevic was a member of this conspiracy. And so, and in the case of Radovan Karadzic, the presiding judge was one of the judges in the Milosevic trial chamber, Judge Kwan. And if Slobodan Milosevic wasn't a member of the joint criminal enterprise in Karadzic and Mladic, then he wasn't a member of the joint criminal enterprise in his own trial either. And, this may have played a role in his death, because it would have been extremely
embarrassing to say the least, to try and come up with a verdict.
Yeah, to try to come up with a verdict that credibly convicts him, because the prosecution had nothing. I mean, I really don't know what they could have said, because I do think that the prosecution managed to prove that crimes had been committed against non-Serbs, but they did not manage to prove that Milosevic had anything to do with those crimes, that he condoned those crimes, or anything of the sort.
His death was, the timing of it was suspiciously convenient, was it not?
It was near what was supposed to be the end of his defense case, although he wasn't really near the end of his defense case. He was near the end of the time that they had allotted for his defense case, but he still had a lot more evidence that he wanted to present.
And it's still your gut feeling that there was foul play was really quite likely.
I think it was. I mean, that rifampicin got into his blood somehow. And either
That,
he
yeah.
either he took it himself or he was poisoned. But the smoking gun is when they found the rifampicin, they didn't tell him. They didn't tell him for months. And then when he found out, and I still don't know exactly how he found out, but somehow he found out within 72 hours of him finding out he's dead, before he has a chance to talk to the public, if he hadn't managed to get that letter to the Russian embassy in The Hague through his lawyer, we wouldn't have known anything about this. They would have just said he had a heart attack, and I bet we wouldn't know word one about rifampicin.
Okay, can you sort of paint us the picture of Mladic basically going into Srebrenica? He's there, as I understand it, to deter Orich and his men who've been conducting 2 years of savage attacks on, I think, wiped out 192 villages and several, maybe 3,000 Serbs in that time in the build-up. He's rather surprised by what he finds in Srebrenica, isn't he? Because it's very quiet.
Yeah, he essentially took it without a fight. The Bosnian Muslims, they fled, and they formed that column and they set off towards Tuzla, which the Bosnian Serbs weren't expecting. And in fact, the UN forces who were in Srebrenica didn't really expect it either. They were surprised that there were weapons that they had confiscated from them. They offered to give them their weapons back to help repel the attack. They didn't do that. Srebrenica is a heavily forested and mountainous area, which they thought that the Bosnian Muslims could have defended, but they didn't do so. And so that all struck them as surprising. The other thing that was surprising was Nasser Oric wasn't there. He had left. And there are Bosnian Muslims, including the police chief in Srebrenica, who say that the government in Sarajevo made a deliberate decision to sacrifice Srebrenica because they were hoping that the Bosnian Serbs would carry out a massacre. They say that Alija Izetbegovic told them that Bill Clinton had promised a NATO intervention if the Serbs were to go into Srebrenica and kill at least 5,000 of its inhabitants. And we also have testimony from Sefer Halilovic, who testified at the tribunal that the Second Corps could have come to the rescue of the column of men who were escaping from Srebrenica, that they were asking for help, but that they decided not to help them. And
effectively, you're saying it was a calculated sacrifice to try and guarantee some military intervention by Clinton and co.
Yeah, it certainly looks that way.
What I don't quite understand is this was supposed to be, taking a slight step back, to be a demilitarized, safe area. The Dutch Bat people, the Dutch battalion there, 80 or 90 men, I think they were They didn't have a mandate to actually enforce peace, did they? They just were peacekeepers. They could only use their weapons if fired upon.
Right.
To what extent does the UN sort of had it fallen down on the job in a big way here?
I mean, General Morion tried to evacuate the civilian population from Srebrenica, and the government in Sarajevo blocked that and wouldn't let him do it. I mean, they wanted the civilian population to be trapped in that enclave. I mean, it was politically useful to them because the materials that were I mean, weapons were getting into Srebrenica, and they were coming into Srebrenica through the humanitarian aid. And the Bosnian Serbs were blocking the humanitarian aid, and there was a lot of deprivation and suffering among the civilian population that was trapped in Srebrenica. But this was politically useful for the government in Sarajevo because then they can point and say, look at all of this, suffering and deprivation that the Bosnian Serbs are causing. They won't even let us have humanitarian aid, even though that's the mechanism by which they're getting their weapons that they're using to go out and then kill Serbs.
So thank you for filling on that sort of gap there, because it's supposedly a safe area. You think, why is it so armed to the teeth and 6,000 men with Nasser and so on under arms? And of course, he's also got a lot of military age men who've been drafted at this stage with him. So the column is maybe what, 10, 12,000? We don't quite know exactly.
Yeah, about 15,000, yeah.
About 15,000 maybe.
Best estimate, yeah.
A lot of them. The problem is for the Serbs, they don't quite know where they're going to go, do they? This is where Zvornik is possibly vulnerable, which was very lightly defended.
Yeah, it may have been a target, and the Zvornik brigade had been deployed to Žepa, and so Zvornik was left basically defenseless, and the Serbs see this column of 6,000, at least 6,000 of those men were armed, and they see this coming towards them, and they've got all of these military age men who they've captured in Zvornik, and they're fearful of what's going to happen if the column attacks Zvornik and liberates these men. And then they've got a huge problem on their hands. They don't have the manpower to guard these prisoners and fight the column if it attacks them. And so they made a, fateful decision to eliminate the prisoners.
But even that said, what I can't get my head around is the mathematics at the end of the day in Tuzla, where the UN record, I think it's about 37,000, 38,000 arriving from all over, and which is pretty much what the original population was estimated of Srebrenica. So where are the bodies?
I mean, bodies have been found, but it's difficult to know the circumstances under which they were killed. I mean, there are internal Bosnian Serb records. There's a combat report from Pandurovic where he says that they have 3,000 men of military age that they're holding in Zvornik. So you have 3,000 men there. And you also have men who were held at a warehouse in Krajvica where the prisoners, tried to wrestle the guns away from their guards. And so the guards retaliated and killed all the prisoners. But that was probably only maybe 500 men. And then you have, incidents in some other places where, some men were captured here and some men were captured there, of maybe 400 altogether. So the Serbs never had more than, like, max, they had 3,900 prisoners who they had captured. So there's no way that they could have executed 8,000 people. But there are, and plus, the men who arrived in Tuzla, there's videos of them saying that, thousands of them had been killed in ambushes and had perished in minefields that the Serbs had laid. And so I think altogether there could have been, there certainly could have been, 7,000 plus men who died in connection with the fall of Srebrenica.
Half legitimate combat and maybe half war crime.
Yeah, exactly. A combination of combat and war crimes.
But
And
not genocide. This is the key thing, is it? Is it not?
no, because the motive wasn't to try to exterminate the Bosnian Muslim ethnic group, which is what genocide is. The motive, like I said, was to defend Zvornik through means that were, criminal. And, by executing the prisoners because they didn't have the manpower to guard them. I mean, it's a violation of the Geneva Conventions and everything else, but it's not genocide. But yeah, the discrepancy in numbers could be due to the fact that you had 37,000 who arrived in Zvornik, and the estimate of the number of people in Srebrenica was 40,000. So it's only like a difference of 3,000 people. But
yeah,
Srebrenica was full of refugees from the surrounding area, and it may be possible that the estimates were wrong, or it may be possible that well, actually, I think the number of men killed, is probably right. I think that the number that the Serbs could have executed, you can cap that at about 3,900. Just based on it's all consistent with the number of buses they say they used to transport the prisoners, the size of the buildings where they were holding the prisoners, because we know which buildings they were housed in. So it's all consistent with altogether total 3,000 in Zvornik, 900 in the Kravica warehouse, and everywhere else combined.
Why is it some weeks before Madeleine Albright? Uh, well, there was no talk immediately, was there, of there having been a genocide or anything of this kind? UN reporters were on the ground in Tuzla. Nobody gave eyewitness accounts, as far as I'm aware, of massacres and things like this going on. It was suddenly when a couple of weeks later she turns up with the spy satellite photographs at the UN, 8 pictures, I think, which purported to show men gathered in fields and then where apparently they'd been buried. These images were locked away promptly for 60 years and nobody really carried them in the press. Why not?
Well, those aerial photographs do show prisoners on the 13th of July, but the number of prisoners that they show, is certainly nowhere near 8,000. Altogether, there's a soccer field in Nova Kasaba and a meadow in Sandici where you see prisoners grouped together, and the number of prisoners visible in that photograph altogether is like 1,200 people, in both of those sites combined. And you also see buses parked in front of that warehouse I mentioned in Kravica. And that warehouse in Kravica could have only housed so many prisoners just based on the size of the building. It's not like a huge, gigantic warehouse. And the warehouse was also in use at the time. There was, from witness testimony, there was a car being stored inside of the warehouse. There was a fence being stored inside the warehouse. The raspberry harvest was being stored inside of the warehouse, and it was being used for prisoners. There was at least 2 busloads of people there, which would have made for maybe, a couple of hundred prisoners there maximum, um, who could have been brought in on those buses. Maybe some of them were brought over from Sandici, but the whole warehouse was only like about 1,000 square foot warehouse.
But
So it's
Albright, you see, issued this warning, didn't she, saying we're watching you, basically, and we're going to have, don't think you can get away with anything. But I didn't quite understand, or don't understand, why the pictures were locked away so nobody can scrutinize them any further, and why we heard nothing more.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, some of those pictures have made their way to the War Crimes Tribunal and been put up as exhibits, and I know because I've seen them. Um, and I published some of them in the book. Um, because those pictures don't show what is purported to have happened, you know. They also have pictures from the Branjevo military farm of what appears to be the aftermath of the execution, where you see, bodies laid out on the ground, and, you know, but it could only be like maybe 700 bodies, which is about what Frank Koss said there were. Um, Not the 1,200 that was alleged by Drazen or Demovich. And even if you look at the grave where they were supposedly buried, it wasn't big enough to accommodate 1,200 bodies. So the yeah, the story isn't really supported by those satellite photographs, so that might be a reason why they wouldn't want to share them. Because the other thing is, like, the photographs that were exhibited by the tribunal, you can tell that they're all oriented to the same compass heading, right? What you see is like a cropped down version of what's obviously a a larger aerial photograph of the whole area, and you see like little zoomed in cropped parts of certain areas, and you don't see the whole area. That hasn't been released.
Well, as you say, essentially because these pictures don't prove the picture they wanted us to have.
Right.
Moving on a little bit now, what does give the picture that they want us to have is the Potocari Genocide Memorial. There are 11,000 gravestones here, and this is an exclusively Muslim cemetery. And it strikes me that this was a purpose-built monument to literally set in stone a false version of history. What's your view of the Potocari Memorial?
Well, I mean, they're equating legitimate combat casualties with people who, were executed illegally, and they're equating the two and making it out to be a genocide. And it's, I mean, it's dishonest. I mean, I can say that. I mean,
What do you think the implications are for the future? Talking about national sort of truth and reconciliation
right.
scenario. I mean, does this sort of thing make it much more difficult for communities to come together?
Well, I think it does. I mean, everybody, I think, has a right to memorialize their dead. I mean, I don't have an issue with the Bosnian Muslims erecting a memorial to the men who were executed. Um, but I do think it's dishonest if you're going to take, men who were died in combat with a rifle in their hands and put them in that category as well, as though all of them were victims of war crimes. And, it's also there are, graveyards full of Serbs around Bratunac and all over in the Drina Valley in eastern Bosnia, full of Serbs who were killed by these Bosnian Muslim soldiers from Srebrenica who went out and destroyed their villages and massacred them. And if there's going to be any governmental support for memorials, they should be those Serbian villagers should be, accorded the same respect as the Srebrenica massacre victims.
I wanted to run by you something that Bill Clinton said at the official opening of that genocide memorial. He said, "I hope the very mention of the name Srebrenica will remind every child in the world that pride in our own religious and ethnic heritage does not require or permit us to dehumanize or kill those who are different. I hope and pray that Srebrenica will be for all the world a sober reminder of our common humanity." What do you make of that comment?
I think it's I think it's self-serving. I mean, because you can't understand Srebrenica without understanding what Nasser Oric did to the Serbs in the surrounding area. And you can't, I mean, I think that probably explains why the idea of simply releasing the prisoners they had captured wasn't anything that was considered by the Bosnian Serbs when they had these men held captive in Zvornik. These men had, at least the military faction they were part of, if not, I'm sure a lot of them personally, but even if not them personally, the military faction that they were a part of had, had committed terrible massacres, like we mentioned earlier, thousands of Serbs in the area, hundreds of villages that were destroyed in the area. So you can't just take one side and put them on a pedestal and vilify the other side, because everybody did things during that war that they shouldn't be proud of. And the Serbs who are responsible for the massacre at Srebrenica, weren't doing it just because they hated Bosnian Muslims and wanted to wipe them out, which is what Bill Clinton is sort of suggesting there. It was to a degree vengeance for what had been done to them and done to their families and their loved ones, because these Serbs in this area had been the victims. I mean, there was a point at the execution at the Branjevo military farm where they had to remove a group of Serbs from Bratunac who were like kind of going crazy, but they had been, they were like crazy with revenge because of what had been done to them. And you have to acknowledge all of this. I mean, the Serbs shouldn't have executed those prisoners, but the Bosnian Muslims should not have used Srebrenica as a base from which to attack the Bosnian Serbs after it had been declared a civilian safe area.
I think you summed that up beautifully, and it's a very fair assessment. Andy, I wanted to move on to Racak,
Yeah.
a fake massacre. This was the long-awaited pretext, was it not, for military intervention? Did you get the impression that it was something that had been pre-planned? Because there was a Republican Party Senate hearing, I think some months before, where it was said that all the plans are in place, all that's needed is a suitably vivid incident that could be written up in the press. Was there by hook or by crook going to be something that they could use as an excuse to bomb?
Well, yeah, the NATO bombing campaign had been planned out before the incident that took place in Racak. So NATO had already planned to carry out its bombing campaign already. They just used the incident at Racak as a pretext to galvanize public opinion. When Bill Clinton announced the bombing campaign, he said something in a speech to the effect of, we should remember what happened at Racak with women and children. There were no women and children victims, but he said, forced to kneel in the mud and then, blown away at the muzzle of a gun. It was something, words to that, like, laid up next to a ditch and then done in by a firing squad. And he said that we should remember that, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. That's why we're going in and bombing.
What actually happened at Racak?
Well, what actually happened at Racak was that Racak was a stronghold of the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was a terrorist organization by everyone's reckoning, including by the U.S. State Department. I mean, there are statements even from people in the Clinton administration that the KLA was without questions a terrorist group. And the FBI had found that it had ties to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. It found this, even before September 11th. So KLA, terrorist group, Racak, stronghold of the KLA. The KLA killed a Serbian police officer. So KLA from Racak killed a Serbian police officer. So Serbian security forces, who were accompanied by observers from the OSCE, went into Racak in order to eliminate the KLA and confiscate their weapons. And they went in there with the OSCE watching them. And there's even video of them going in, and you can see that the OSCE is perched on a hill overlooking where this massacre supposedly happened. They've got their vans there. They're watching. The Serbs go in. They fight the KLA, and there's even videotape of this. So they go in, they fight the KLA, and they confiscate some of their weapons, and some of the KLA fighters got killed during the combat. What happens is that the KLA fighters that got killed in combat were then taken and positioned in this trench outside of the village where the OSCE had been watching. And this is after the combat is over and the OSCE leaves. They position these combat casualties as though they had been massacred. And the Then they bring in William Walker, who has himself a history in Latin America. In fact, where he was involved in covering up massacres. Uh,
Jesuit priest, wasn't it, in
yeah,
El Salvador?
Jesuit
Yeah.
priest in El Salvador, yeah.
Uh,
And so they bring him in, and he brings in a bunch of journalists and points and says, look at this terrible war crime these horrible Serbs have committed here. And the the there was after that though, there was a joint investigation involving uh forensic scientists from, I think it was Sweden, it was some Scandinavian country headed by Helena Ranta.
I was Finland. Yes, that's right.
Finland.
Yeah.
It was some country in Scandinavia, and there was some Belarusians and some Serbs, and it was a joint international investigation, and they looked at the bodies, and what they could tell is like the first thing is none of these people had been shot at close range. Uh, Second finding was that they found gunpowder residue on their hands, indicating that they had been firing weapons. And they also found that these men had been dressed in order to spend prolonged periods, like they were bundled, they were like ready to be outside, right? It wasn't like they were in their homes and the Serbs came and got them and took them and massacred them. These guys had been outside and they were dressed to be outside because it was January. And the the trajectories of the bullets that had hit them were coming from like all kinds of different directions. So these weren't just people who had been lined up at the edge of this ditch and all methodically, you know, done in by, you know, people putting a gun to their head and killing them. These were people who, you know, the bullets were coming this way and that way, and they had gunpowder residue on their hands. They were dressed up to be outside. These were the combat casualties from that raid.
Now, Helena Ranta, the woman who was running the Finnish end of things, she was put under enormous pressure, was she not, to say that this was a massacre, but she never did.
No, she never did. She never said it wasn't, and she never said it was. She wasn't, you know, completely pure. I mean, she left the door open for it to be one, but she never definitively claimed that it was. And but you know, she did say that none of them had been shot at close range. That
Is
was
it
one of her findings.
is it true? I think I read somewhere that the William Walker had actually been seen earlier, before any of this became public, as though he'd been sort of checking with the KLA, or that things would, you know, the stage management was right.
Yeah,
Do you know anything about that?
a Yugoslav military patrol saw him the night before the raid going to Racak. And the OSCE, because like I said, they were there to observe when the Serbs carried out the raid, had been notified in advance the raid was going to happen. So to see William Walker, who was the head of the OSCE mission, going to Racak the night before.
And I mean, the other incredible thing was, and why the whole thing stank always, was that because there was the presence of a TV crew there. I think
Yeah,
it was AP Press or somebody had anyway, there was a television crew there. So, you know, the likelihood of somebody trying to
carry out
carry
a
out that sort of massacre is incredibly remote, isn't it?
well,
But
yeah, because I mean the OSCE was there and the Associated Press, and I also believe Reuters was there. So you have journalists, you have the OSCE, you're there with the Serbs.
And then you get Walker on the phone, as I understand it, straight away to was it no, it wasn't Madley. Wesley Clark, I think he rang, and Holbrook, and then denied that he'd spoken to either of them, although both of them said he had rung and said, you know, this is terrible.
Did he seek direct instruction now from the Americans?
Without calling on any of my capitals, I told what I thought I had seen, which was the end result of a massacre.
William Walker, the head of the Kosovo verification mission, called me on a cell phone from Racak.
But you don't remember calling Washington at all?
I got a call from Bill Walker. He said, there's a massacre. I'm standing here. I can see the bodies.
And you didn't speak to General Clark or anybody like that?
Have you heard this?
No, that's interesting. That's another piece that I hadn't heard.
He was so proud of, you know, what he thought he pulled off, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I mean, and, you know, he had been, like I say, I mean, that guy was no humanitarian. I mean, we saw what he did in El Salvador. And, you know, he was also, you know, rumored to have been involved, I think, in drug trafficking as well. I mean, the guy had written all over him that he was CIA.
And he had been specially recruited, had he not, by Madeleine Albright, to because he was a tough guy.
He may have been. He may have been. I don't know. Appointed him, but that would not surprise me.
Okay. Final thing, really, and this is really ending up with what I think got you interested in the whole thing as when you're a college student is the whole sort of Kosovo thing, and you know, what was the Serb story from Kosovo? Why did we only ever hear about the Albanian side of things? Kosovo was always it's the cradle of Serbian civilization, isn't it? And hundreds of churches and this sort of thing. I mean, it's like a sort of Jerusalem for them. It's a very, very special place. And the Albanians had basically been out to colonize it for a long time, had they not?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, since at least the 1800s. I mean, the Serbs were, you know, in the 19th century, and for centuries before that, the Serbs were the overwhelming majority population there. And from, you know, the late 1800s up until the present day, the Albanians have been methodically driving them out.
What was the proportion of the population roughly when things started going wrong?
When things started going wrong in the 90s, you mean?
Yeah, yeah. Was it like a 60-40 split, or
it was probably more like 80-20.
And at what point does the KLA come onto the scene, which of course was largely resourced and armed and everything by the Germans and the Americans, and with help from Britain as well. When does the KLA put in a big appearance?
They start to come around in the mid 90s, around 1996, 1997. Initially, they got their funding from, there were some pyramid schemes that were, you know, got big, kind of out of hand in Albania. And when these pyramid schemes collapsed, it almost tanked the Albanian economy. And the KLA wound up the recipient of a lot of those funds. So a lot of the money that the KLA initially had been basically, you know, the Albanian people have been scammed out of it. Because, I mean, at its core, the KLA is the mafia. It's an organized crime racket.
And it's pretty well armed, wasn't it? Because, I mean, didn't they not break into all the armories in Albania?
Yeah, they did. They did, because, when these pyramid schemes collapsed, there was civil unrest, and they took that opportunity to basically go into the armories in Albania and steal all the weapons.
How strong was this army? How many people are we talking about? And was it all being trained in Albania initially?
Well, yeah, a lot of them were trained in Albania. I mean, the KLA, I think, would have had at its, I mean, I don't really want to give an estimate of at its strongest point, but I think certainly in the tens of thousands of men. But I'm not sure like what it was at its peak strength. I don't think that initially it had a lot of public support, but as it became more powerful, it became difficult to oppose, and in fact unsafe for an Albanian to oppose, because the majority of the KLA's victims, up until NATO started bombing Yugoslavia, the majority of the KLA's victims were disloyal Albanians. So it's also kind of hard to gauge how much public support that the KLA had among the Albanian people, because if an Albanian were to step out of line, the KLA would be coming for them.
Of course, once the NATO bombing began, my understanding is the KLA were basically telling other Albanians they've got, for patriotic reasons, to leave, to flee, to get the TV pictures and make everything look like all hell was breaking loose.
Yeah. And there's Albanian witnesses who even came forward to testify in the Milosevic trial that the KLA had done exactly that. And there were also European parliamentarians and observers who went to Kosovo on fact-finding missions and learned the same thing.
What do you think the future for Kosovo is now?
I think that it's, kind of bleak. I don't think it's going to be successful as an independent country, just because of the sheer amount of corruption and political intimidation in that society. I mean, and it's also kind of caught in a limbo where, some countries like the United States and most NATO countries recognize it as an independent state. And then you have other countries, including very large countries, Russia, China, that don't recognize it, the BRICS countries by and large, that don't recognize it as an independent state. So it'll be difficult for Kosovo to, I don't think anyone's changing their position anytime soon. So it's, sort of a bad position. I mean, it would have been better for Kosovo and for the people there if, they could have just participated in Serbian society and in Serbian politics, citizens of Serbia, with autonomy and with their right to their own language and all the rest of it.
I think I know the answer to this nearly last question I want to ask you. Was humanitarianism a factor in any of what the Americans and the NATO countries did?
It's pretty obvious that it wasn't. I mean, just look at right now, what the United States is supporting in the Middle East. There have been more women and children that have been killed in Gaza since the 7th of October, 2023, than all of the women and children killed in Bosnia and in Kosovo combined. I mean, sort of like let that sink in. And we're still backing the Israelis to the hilt. That's not gonna change. And nobody has any humanitarian concern for all of the women and children that they're killing right now. And previous to the wars in the former Yugoslavia, Madeleine Albright famously went on 60 Minutes and said that the 500,000 Iraqi children who had died as a result of U.S. sanctions on Iraq were worth it just to undermine Saddam Hussein. The idea that a government like the United States, who imposed sanctions that killed 500,000 children in Iraq and are supporting a war effort in Gaza that's killed, tens of thousands of women and children, was motivated by humanitarian concern. I mean, it's just laughable. I mean, all of the support that we've given to the Israelis since October 7th to do what they've done in Gaza, I mean, that was all overseen by Joe Biden, who was one of the biggest proponents of military intervention in the former Yugoslavia. I mean, it's not motivated by humanitarianism. And then Madeleine Albright, with her remark, and she was the one who was saying that for humanitarian reasons we need to bomb Yugoslavia, over Kosovo. I mean, it's laughable.
I think you may have answered my last question, and this really is my last one, which is there going to be any change soon? Is Trump suddenly going to end all these wars in a day or so?
I think that there's not going to be any change with regard to Israel. He's going to back Israel just as much, if not more, than Biden did. With respect to Ukraine, there might be a change. The guy that he just appointed as defense secretary has had mixed positions on this issue. Initially in 2022, he said that the United States should supply Ukraine with all of the support it needs to fight the Russians. But, last year he began saying that Ukraine isn't our war and that we shouldn't support them at all. So under Trump, there may be a chance that we extricate ourselves from this conflict in Ukraine, which, if that's the only thing that comes of the Trump administration, I would say that's worth it, because that's the, really the most dangerous conflict that we're involved in, because the United States and Russia are the number one and number two nuclear powers in the world. Both countries have enough nuclear weapons, we could destroy the world several times over. I mean, a full-on nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia is estimated to result in the death of 5 billion people. So if we can, get out of Ukraine, which I'm hopeful that we might, I'm not 100% convinced. I'll believe it when I see it, but I think it's more likely to happen under Trump than it would have been to happen under Kamala Harris.
Andy, that's another fascinating encounter. I'd like to thank you so much for all your time. We'll give the details of your book and everything else, but it's been great talking to you, and I hope that we can, do this again sometime in the future. But I mean, real insights and very valuable. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. I enjoyed it.